All right, we're continuing our study on the book of Genesis. Today we're going to be covering chapter 1. We'll see how far we get through chapter 1. Hopefully we'll be able to cover all of it, though. If not, then we'll continue on until next week. But let's begin in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you once again, Lord, that we're able to come to your word, to see the richness of your word, the color in it, to help us understand both who you are, what you are, and what you are doing in the world. In an effort to also then understand who we are and what we should be doing in the world. And much of this is even in the very first chapter of the Bible. And I pray, Lord, that we see it with eyes wide open, that we don't bring in all these traditions that simply obscure what it's saying, but instead that we're eager to learn perhaps something new about it that we didn't know before. And so open our eyes, Lord, help us to be teachable to you, and teach us what we really need to know about Genesis 1 and the book of Genesis in general. Help us then to also guide these debates that are often given over the chapter into the right direction. I pray, Lord, for your people, that they become priests to the world in this way. They understand your word well and are able then to discuss it with others intelligently. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. All right. Well, let's go ahead and read the passage.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
All right, so back to verse 1. Of course, it should be no surprise that there is an immediate debate over even the very first word of this book. There's probably more ink spilt on Genesis 1 through 11 than probably any other place in the Bible, maybe Revelation as well, I'm not sure. But there's a lot of controversy, obviously, in Genesis 1 through 11, and especially Genesis 1 in particular. And so we'll talk a little bit about this, but we're really going to try to focus in on how an ancient Near Eastern reader would have read this as opposed to a modern person that might be interested in more of the science debate or something. And we'll talk a little bit about that after we talk about, I think we go through the passage a little bit. And there's some key things I think we need to understand about the chapter in order to understand what's being said. And you might say, well, I already know what's being said. It sounds pretty clear to me. But I think there's a lot more here that's often missed because, again, we're reading as a modern reader. We're reading it as though it's just fact. This is the way God made everything, and there's no theology in it. There's no ethics in it. God's not conveying anything else. And so I want us to see what God is ultimately conveying through this chapter. Well, it's, again, no surprise, the very first word, there's controversy, and so it actually can be taken, this first sentence, in 4 different ways, maybe even more than that. But we'll just cover 4 of them in which you can take it. The sentence, of course, is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. And it's traditionally translated as, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This seems pretty straightforward in that regard. The question becomes whether this is an introductory statement that sums up the rest of the chapter, meaning in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then 2 through 31 is all of that creating that Genesis 1:1 was talking about. In other words, it's Genesis 1:1 is just summing up everything from 2 to 31. The next way to take it is as a first act of creation. So God created the heavens and the earth, and then the earth was formless and void at that point, and then he started creating from there, let there be light, and splitting the waters, and the land, and all that sort of thing. And so it's just the first step. God made the cosmos, and then he continued to develop it from there. Well, some of the controversy that comes in for the other 2 is that it might also be a dependent clause. And the reason why it's taken by many to be a dependent clause is because Bereshit is actually in the construct form. It's not Bereshon, which it would be, in the beginning, just by itself. But if you were to read it, just by itself, Bereshit, it would be in the beginning of. Or as some people do in constructs, when God began creating the heavens and the earth, or something like that. And so it's seen as a dependent clause in that regard. Now, part of the problem with this is that it's followed by a finite verb, bara. Bara is the word he created. Usually, you can't have a construct on a verb. And so traditionally what has occurred, for instance, with like Kittel and whatnot, is there's been an emendation that occurs from bara to baro, which is an infinitive, so it's in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. And look, that's possible just because the Masoretic pointing is not inspired. The Masoretic pointing is something that, from tradition, is put on much, much later. I mean, we're talking, early Middle Ages that we have it there. So it's very possible that it's in construct to the infinitive and whatnot, and that's fine. But that means you have two possibilities for the dependent clause. It may be in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and earth, and then the verse 2 is actually a parenthetical. Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness hovered over the face of the waters. But darkness was upon the face of the waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And then it continues the main clause in 3, and God said, "Let there be light." So at the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, God said, "Let there be light." That's how you would actually take it. The other way to view it is at the beginning of God's creating the heavens and earth, the earth was formless and void. And so the independent clause is actually verse 2. Here's the gist of it. In the end, I do actually think it's probably a dependent clause. I think it's probably when God began creating the heavens and earth, in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and earth, however you want to take it. I don't know if you would really have a parenthetical there in the middle of a dependent and then independent clause. I'm not sure if you would. It doesn't really sound like it would be that case. So I would take it to be at the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth was formless and void. That is, we're starting at the point where the earth already exists, the heavens already exist in that regard, but not in an ordered form. They're chaotic. And so God is going to begin at the beginning of his creation, everything is actually chaos, and he needs to order it. Now, you might say, yeah, but God made everything out of nothing, though. Well, yeah, we understand that from other texts, but here in Genesis 1, it's not starting there. Most ancient Near Eastern accounts of creation don't start there. And Genesis is part of its cognitive environment. It's not, people aren't concerned about, they already know, yeah, whatever came into being must have come about from the creator deity or some deity or something. The idea is who's ordering it. Because even in certain creation accounts, it's not even the first deity that creates. It's the most powerful deity that creates. It's the supreme deity that creates. He orders what is chaotic. Whether you're talking about like Marduk in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, or you're talking about Baal, even though the Baal cycle is not a creation account per se, he is ordering things that are chaotic. And he therefore is seen as the supreme deity. But he's not the first deity. That's El, who is the father of the gods and whatnot. The same thing here in Genesis. You're going to have it begin in the state of chaos. Now, God, of course, is the only God. There aren't other gods. And so he's the only God in this situation. But he's also then seen as the supreme God over maybe the other false gods of the ancient Near East, in that he is the one who actually orders the world. And so Yahweh, what we're going to find out in the next chapter, that this is Yahweh, is ordering the world. Now, as I said before, it uses the word Elohim in chapter 1, because remember, this is the transcendent view of creation. It's from God's perspective, from heaven on down. And so you get the perspective of God. The cosmos and the stars are mentioned, and the sun and the moon, and the abysmal waters and all of that are actually being created and ordered and all that. All the stuff that you're not going to have in Genesis 2, because Genesis 2 is from man's perspective, from the earth on up. So here you have the transcendent view of God, and you're going to ultimately have God completely sovereign over all these things, ordering the world, and in the end of Genesis 1, having no threat of chaos. And so as we work through it, he creates the heavens and the earth in the beginning, of course. And the earth was tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu are often translated, they've been translated, I think, in the KJV, as formless and void. That's probably the most common understanding or translation that we have of it. Formless and void are kind of there, but I think people read over it and they don't quite get it. What it's trying to say is that the earth is not a habitable place. It's uninhabitable. That's what tohu means. Tohu usually describes like a desert or some place that's just unlivable for humans. You can have animals there, but not for humans. And so creation is in a state of chaos. And that's what chaos ultimately means. It's referring to somewhere that cannot be lived by humans, and therefore bohu is uninhabited by humans. It's not a place that can be inhabited by human beings. So it's not a place that can be inhabited and therefore is not inhabited by human beings. And again, bohu is used to refer to a place that's empty of humans. Again, there are animals there, but humans are not there. So what it should really be translated as something like, and the earth was uninhabitable and therefore uninhabited, meaning by human beings. So that the state of chaos is a state where the earth cannot support human life and there is no human life on it. You're going to see the same thing in Genesis 2. The problem of chaos is there's no man to till the ground. So there's no cultivated land, habitable area, because there's no man to help in tilling the ground and making the earth inhabitable. So this is important because we understand then that the state of chaos has to do with humanity directly in terms of what can support the life of humanity and make it flourish versus what cannot. And that the state of chaos is also a state where humans don't exist. They're not being created, they're not existing, they cannot exist there, and therefore they don't. That's important because then now what we're going to see in verses 3 through 25 is God's going to reverse the state of tohu. He's going to make the cosmos a place that man can inhabit. And so he does that by ordering it, and with each time that he orders it, he says that it's tov. Except for on the second day, which is interesting, because the second day doesn't necessarily directly relate to something that man can directly benefit from. So it's fascinating that on the second day, it's not mentioned that it's good. In fact, let's go ahead and read the second day on verse 6. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters." So he's creating this kind of bubble in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse. Now, literally, this is the rakia. And separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. So he creates the sky here and the rakia, which I would argue is like this ceiling for the sky. But it doesn't directly, like man doesn't live in the sky. It doesn't directly relate to man in some way. And so there's no statement that it's tov, good. Because it's very important to understand that when God says it is good, that he saw that it was good, he means tov as in it's ordered. Ordered specifically for the chaotic state of the earth, to reverse it, to reverse the chaos, and make it a place that's livable for man. Well, again, man doesn't live in the sky, so it's not something that's direct there. So God doesn't make the statement that it's tov. Even though we understand it's ordered and it's part of creation, it's not directly relating to man, and therefore he doesn't make the statement. It's the only time he doesn't make the statement. Everything else is more direct, because it's reversing the state of tohu vavohu. And that's what good means then, tov. Very important again. Put a pin in that and understand, because we're going to talk a lot about that a little bit later. So God makes these statements that it's good. If you notice, after the verses 3 through 25, he's going to then command to reverse the state of bohu, which is he's going to command that the earth become inhabited then. And so by ordering the world and then commanding the humans, making the humans, and then commanding them to be fruitful and multiply, he's going to reverse the state of tohu vavohu. And this is the way God creates. Again, put a pin in that. We will come back to it in a moment. Now, part of what feeds into, I think, the overall theology of Genesis and the theology here in 1 is the idea that creation is actually being described as a temple. And so you have a temple structure being built. And there's a lot of evidence for this. This is a great book on the subject. This is my book, actually.
I can help you. Yes.
Thank you.
Bob, there is a groundbreaking new book that has just come out. Now, not everything in this book, of course, applies to you, but I'm sure that you can see, when you see the title, exactly how it could help.
But you can get a hold of this for free online, and it'll present a lot of evidence for the temple. I won't be able to cover all of it here. There's a lot of things that are said in Genesis 1 that indicate we're dealing with the temple in Genesis 1. And one of the things is the fact that you have the 7-day structure. Now, there's a lot of debate over, God. It says that God made everything in 6 days, rested on the seventh, and therefore it's literal. But many scholars have noted that the 7-day structure is not just with the 7 days, by the way. It's actually with numerous things in the chapter that are mentioned 7 times. Even the word tov, so the comment that something is tov, is mentioned 7 times, even though it's not on the 2nd day. So the author went out of his way to actually say it a 7th time because he needed that 7th one, even though he doesn't tack it on to the 2nd day, because you normally would think, well, there's 7 days, therefore he says it's good 7 times. But that's not what happens. He only says it's good on 6 days, and then he has a second time that he says it, but it's on the 6th day, he doesn't say it's good at all. I wanted to read this to you. This is from an article by Jeffrey Morrow. It's called Creation as Temple Building and Work as Liturgy in Genesis 1 through 3. It's from the Journal of Orthodox Center for the Advancement of Biblical Studies, Volume 2, and from 2009, 1 through 13 pages there. And he's largely quoting, I believe, John Levinson in his Creation and the Persistence of Evil. But this is what he says. Hardly limited to the 7 days in which the action takes place, groups or multiples of 7 appear throughout the passage. The first verse, for example, consists of 7 words. The second of 14. Of the 3 dominant terms of verse 1, that is God, heaven, and earth, the first occurs 35 times, so 5 sevens, in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. That's the actual pericope, creation pericope of the first creation account. The second and third of total of 21 times each, so 3 sevens. In the description of the first day, light is mentioned 5 times, and day, which 1:5 defines as its synonym, twice. The total is again 7. In the passages devoted to the to the 5th and 6th days, the word chaya, living thing or alive, occurs a total of 7 times. The key expression, ki tov, that it was good, appears 7 times. Mysteriously omitted on the 2nd day, it occurs twice on the 3rd and the 6th. The last time with extra force, very good, that's tov ma'od. The paragraph devoted to the 7th day consists of 35 words, 21 of which form 3 sentences of 7 words, each of which includes the expression the 7th day. The first sentence of the paragraph includes 5 words, that is 2 fewer than we expect, but that the last sentence, which follows the 3 heptads, consists of 9 words and thus compensates for the deficiency of the incipit, leaving us with 5 sentences that average 7 words apiece for a total of 35. Now, I'm not into the whole Bible codes number thing or whatever, but it's very clear because primeval history functions somewhat like apocalyptic literature does later on. It does care about symbolism in terms of time, in terms of numbers, and so it does kind of do a lot of this. And this has been noted by other people. Umberto Consuto, I think, is it Umberto Cassuto or Umberto Cassuto? I forget. But Cassuto essentially is another biblical author who points this out. Scholars have noted it for a long time. I mean, it's going to be in pretty much every commentary that you can think of. That 7 is all over the place in Genesis 1. So is it a coincidence? Why are 7s all over the place? Is it because just God made everything 7 days and it's literal? Well, why is it being used figuratively in all these other ways by having this word 7 times and that word 7 times? And, why is it doing this? Well, because I think it's not literal. I think instead that the 7-day structure in the ancient Near East is the time frame used to purify and build a temple. And so you have this number 7 used for that reason. In the construction of Baal's temple, Baal has his temple built or purified by fire in 7 days. And so I wanted to read this to you, this from the Baal cycle. It says, "Quickly his palace was built. Quickly his temple was raised. Fire was set in the palace, flames in the temple. Behold, the fire consumed in the palace. A day and a second. The flames in the temple, the fire consumed the palace. A third, a fourth day. The flames in the temple, the fire consumed in the palace. A fifth, a sixth day. The flames in the midst of the temple. Then, on the 7th day, the fire escaped from the palace, the flames from the temple, the silver had turned into plates, the gold had been turned into bricks. Mightiest Baal did rejoice. I have built my palace of silver, my temple of gold." And so, notice here, this is an ordering. You have the fire representing the ordering from chaos to something that's created. So the unformed gold turns into bricks. The unformed silver turns into plates. And he has created his temple on 7 days. The 7-day structure can be seen in a temple inscription about the Gudea temple. You have in the Solomon temple, you have it in 14 years. That is 2 7s. There's a dedication ceremony that's a 7 again. And 7 in general is a concept in the ancient Near Eastern world of completion, of taking something from imperfection to perfection. And so it's typically used of temple building. And so what we've got here really is we've got the creation of God's temple. And so we see this idea later on, Isaiah 66. Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. Where then is there a temple that you can build for me? A place you can build for me? A house you can build for me? And the idea is you can't. It's the universe is God's temple, described as his throne and footstool. That's his temple, the place in which he resides, the place in which he'll rest, showing off his sovereignty, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so there's a lot here that describes that. I mentioned before that what's translated as expanse typically is the word rakia. A rakia is a solid substance. It's a solid roof, basically. And so you have a solid roof holding back the waters that were described as Tehom, which are these chaotic waters that are pressing against, real creation. They represent chaos themselves. The ceiling is holding them back. That's kind of the idea. And so you've got a ceiling on this cosmos, on the earth and everything. You've got sun and moon and stars, which typically on the ceilings of temples you would have, because they represent kind of a microcosmic cosmos. Here you've got the actual heavens and earth that are described as a temple. And so you've got priestly language used here, numerous things. You've got word at the center, because in the Israelite temple, the word, that is the Ten Commandments, are the center of the temple. But then you have something said of man. So as we jump down to verse 26, there's something important here that God says of man. And it says that he basically says, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And that God makes man as his image and like his likeness. Meaning that you've got basically man representing God as his idol in the temple. Because that's where you house idols. They go in temples. That's where you put your image, in a temple. If you're a god, you put an image in the temple. And many people have noted the fact that man is God's image in terms of also royalty, the kingship idea, because kings are actually seen as living idols that represent the deity. And so when they give law, for instance, they're giving law representing the deity and giving law and whatnot as the shepherd of the deity and whatnot, and representing his rule over chaos. Again, we'll come back to this in a moment. I think it's important. But understand then that the temple idea is an idea that is in Genesis 1 because the temple orders what's around it. In this case, the entire universe is ordered. And therefore, God rules over whatever area his temple exists in. And here, it's the entire universe, meaning that this God, whoever is creating, so imagine we don't know who it is yet. We're reading the Bible anew for the first time, reading Genesis 1. This God, whoever is creating, is the sovereign God over all things. His temple is everything. It's not localized in a particular land like all the other gods. It's actually the entire universe that makes up his temple, showing that he is sovereign over all things. Now, part of this is then the idea that God has sovereignly created all. In Genesis 1, from his perspective, it's done. He's sovereign over all things. There's no threat of chaos, and therefore he rests on a throne. And a lot of people are unfamiliar with the fact of the rest idea. They think that, they're like God took a nap or something. And it's like, no. Or that God's power was drained from him as he created. No. The rest idea has to do with taking upon a seat or resting in the temple as a seat, as a throne over which you rule the rest of creation. This is, again, it's seen in the Baal epic. It's seen with Marduk in the Babylonian creation account. It's a common theme. Bado has a book called The Slaying of the Dragon that goes through this idea and brings it out. But you'll see it in the commentaries as well. If you look at Wenham's commentary, Westermann's commentary, these are good commentaries to have. In fact, I would recommend Wenham's commentary probably above all the commentaries that are updated. Hopefully they're working on some new ones. I mentioned before how there's not really a lot of good commentaries or whatnot. But that idea of the temple is that where the temple is, that God rules and everything is ordered by that God within that sphere. Genesis 1 has it all ordered by God. He rests in his temple. It's done. There's no threat of chaos left. Over. And that's part of the theology of the book. Remember that from God's perspective, evil is already taken care of. Chaos already is done. It's not that way because we're seeing it in time, as we discussed before. We're in Genesis 2 through Revelation 21-22. We're in the middle of that, not at the end of it. God's already at Revelation 21-22 in terms of his perspective upon chaos and whether or not he's dealt with evil. He has dealt with it. It's done. He's sitting on the throne. That's it. We're just experiencing the process of that because we don't see as God sees. We're not the eternal now. We don't see presently the future, past, and all of that. He is above time, so he's not bound by any of that. We are. So we're still experiencing it. So he rests upon the throne. Now, why are we mentioned as his images? This is very important. The image is not just in Genesis 1, something like a regular image. You just sit it in the temple and it just sits there. In fact, in most of the ancient Near East, that's not really what the image does either. It provides a means through which the deity continues to order and hold chaos at bay. To order chaos, to create, to hold it at bay, to basically order the place that's around it. So the God works through it to do that. Well, how is God working through his images in Genesis 1? What is the image all about? What's the role of the image? Well, it's the creation mandate. Be fruitful in order to multiply. Multiply in order to fill up the earth. Fill up the earth in order to subdue it. Subdue it in order to rule over it. So as man rules over the earth, he represents God who rules over chaos in the earth. But what is chaos? Well, we just said chaos is when the earth becomes a place that cannot support human life. And chaos is non-human life. That is, there's no humans inhabiting it. So chaos ultimately is a state where man does not exist. And this is important because here's where we're going to talk about the foundation of Genesis and Genesis 1 over the rest of the Bible in terms of its ethics. So what I want us to see then is this, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man as his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill up the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Now, I want you to notice that the creation mandate he gives is linked to the subduing. In other words, it's not, hey, go grab a sword and subdue the earth. That's not what is commanded here. What has been done with the creation mandate, you can see even the title, creation mandate, or cultural mandate is what it's actually called, is that, oh, well, we're supposed to just subdue everything through every means possible, as long as we're godly or whatever. That's not the point here at all. Now, I'm not saying that you wouldn't do that. I'm just saying that's not the point. That's not the role of the image. The role of the image is, first and foremost, be fruitful and multiply. Why? Because you're going against the chaotic state of not having any humans on the earth. That is, you're joining with God as he creates through you. You're flowing with creation rather than against it, doing tov, good, ordering the world by having children, being fruitful, multiplying. Why are you multiplying? To fill up the earth. Why are you filling up the earth? In order to subdue it. Why are you subduing it? In order to rule over it. So you can see they're all one command. It's not a bunch of different commands to where being fruitful and multiply has nothing to do with subduing and ruling over the earth. No, subduing and ruling over the earth is through the means of being fruitful and multiplying. That is the whole point. That's why Genesis is called Genesis, and it's brought together by the Toledot structure, the Yalad, birthings, and it's held together in that way. That's why there's going to be a lot of the whole narrative is going to be moved forward through these birthings, the Toledot. We're going to have genealogies. We're going to have a discussion of who are the image of God and who are not, and that there's two seeds. Both the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent in Genesis 3, and see how that all plays out. And ultimately that'll feed into who Israel is going to be versus the rest of the world. So it's very important to understand that God is continuing his creation, as we argued before last time, that we're in the middle of creation, that this is a continued thing, and we join with him in creating the world as his instruments, through which he continues to create the world. And by create, I mean reversing the state of an uninhabitable world and reversing the state of it being uninhabited. And how do we participate? Well, in Genesis 2, it doesn't say so much here, but in Genesis 2, we're going to cultivate the land, make it more habitable, and he'll work through us that way. But here it's specifically said on, we'll reverse the state of the world being uninhabited. And the idea, of course, is uninhabited by God's covenant human beings, not just anyone. God doesn't want you to fill the world with murderers. I mean, the point is that this is in a context where his actual images, people in relationship to him, his sons that he has created, they're going to work in the world with him in order to fulfill the creation mandate, be fruitful and multiply, that God can now reverse the state of the world as a place that is not inhabited with human beings, his covenant human beings. We see later in Malachi, why did he make the two one flesh and all that sort of thing? It's going to be because he wanted godly offspring. That was the point. That's why he makes them male and female here in Genesis 1. And so God works through us that way. Well, that means this. It means that whatever you do that works toward the creation and reversal of chaos, the creation of the world, the ordering of the world, the creation mandate against chaos, is considered tov. In fact, it's called tov ma'od. It's good to the utmost. That's what good is. Good is what is creational. This is where we get this terminology. It is creational. It works with God in his purposes to create the world. And by create, again, we mean to reverse the state of chaos. The world as an uninhabitable place, and the world as uninhabited by by people that he wants to be his images, his covenant human beings. That means that anything you do that flows with God in terms of this is good. Anything you do that works against it and works toward returning the world to a state of chaos, to a state that it is uninhabitable, and to a state that it's uninhabited, is what is chaotic / raw evil. So you see then that even in the first creation account, you get the idea that what is tov is not purely just talking about the perfection of anything. In fact, that's not even what the word is referring to. It's talking about creation, and it has a moral implication. For when the image of God joins with God, they also are to do tov, joining God in creation as his instruments, as his image through which he orders the world, just like a God normally orders a particular place through his idol, through his image. Only we are ordering the entire chaos, the entire world this way, from chaos, turning into what is ordered, what can support human life, and what is actually bringing human life into the world. And so it's very important because the entire ethic of the Bible is going to be drawn from this concept. Our ideas of sexuality, which you're going to see throughout Genesis, and you're going to have a contrast in Genesis between ordered sexuality that works with God in creating and disordered sexuality that works against God and simply puts more chaos in the world. It's chaotic, it leads to death in the end, whereas ordered sexuality leads to life and creation. That's the point of it. And so you have ordered relationships that are the male-female relationship that God made in Genesis 1 in order to order the world. And therefore, it's seen as creational, the male-female relationship, when you're talking about two covenant people coming together and seeking to have children in marriage. But other things that are disordered, they're not going to be seen as that great. And even things that the law might tolerate in Genesis will not be seen that great if they are somewhat disordered in some way, either in terms of creation, that is bringing about children. Usually that's called out as evil even in the law. But even in terms of preservation, that things that maybe you brought a child into a situation that you shouldn't have because your marriage is either from a polygamous marriage, or maybe it's prostitution or something like that. Those are going to be frowned on in Genesis because they're not as preservational. It's about also ordering things in order to make them livable spaces for the humans that you're going to bring in to the world. That God is bringing into the world through you, I should say, by the way, because Genesis is going to emphasize that it's God who opens and closes the womb. And so it's God working through the male and female to do this. Well, all of this is important then because we're going to see this ethic played out time and again through the book of Genesis, and then it's going to go on and continue through the Bible. You're going to get it in Leviticus, in the Holiness Code. It's going to provide the foundation for the law. What preserves life? What creates life? What takes it away? Well, that's going to be evil. What gives life? Well, that's going to be ordered and good. What takes away the life of an agent of chaos will be seen as good. And yet what takes away the life of someone who is not necessarily an agent of chaos, that will be seen as bad and therefore murder. And so a lot of things are defined based on this understanding that man is to be God's image as a role that he plays. And that also means, we're going to see later, that man can decide, I'm not going to enter into that role. And therefore is not God's image. Because he's not going to be the instrument through which God creates the world. At least he's not going to be the instrument through God creates the world intentionally. He's not joining in. God's going to use everything, of course, to create the world, but he's not going to function specifically as an image of God in relationship to God, as a son of God, through which God creates through him in order to order everything. All right, so that is the gist of Genesis 1. I know there's a lot more here. I mean, we could talk about, the fact that God gives them food and it's, vegetation at first and all that sort of thing. That's also to support their lives. The seventh day structure will be used later for the Sabbath in order to remember this whole theology. And that's really why the Sabbath is remembered later on. We'll talk about that when we get into Exodus. But ultimately, it's to remember that God is sovereign. God already has everything set in place. Even his telling the humans to be fruitful and multiply, there's an assumption that, that all happened and it's good and chaos that's it. I mean, he can see everything that it's good and there's no threat and we're done. And so he's resting on the throne. All of that in here, it will play into various themes that we see throughout the Bible, but particularly the Sabbath, why the Sabbath is so important in the Old Testament, and why, like a man picking up sticks on the Sabbath, for instance, ignoring it is so bad. Because ultimately, it means that he is rejecting the sovereignty of God and rejecting all of this theology that God wants his people to learn so that they understand not only that he is the God who has everything ordered, but they need to also then, in obedience to him, be his images, and he will then work to order things. They don't need to do it on their own. They don't need to be their own gods and go do it. He'll do it. And that's why they're to observe Sabbath in the Old Testament. Now, we have a little bit different of a thing where we observe Sunday, of course, because it's the new creation, and we're acknowledging that God has now completed it. We're actually acknowledging Sabbath with our Sundays, with the Lord's Day, because we're looking back on what God has done and also forward to what God's doing through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so, again, those are things we'll talk about when we get there, and we're a long way out from getting there, obviously. That's Genesis 1 in a nutshell. Now, we can discuss more of this when we get on Jitsi and all of that. I do recommend to you Wenham's commentary. Again, it'll cover a lot of this. I'll recommend, my book to you if you want to dive a little bit deeper into it. There are other books that talk about the Genesis 1 as a temple. I mentioned John Levinson and the creation and the persistence of evil. There's John Walton, Genesis 1 as ancient cosmology. He also has a book called The Lost World of Genesis 1. There are numerous articles on the subject. It's recognized widely that Genesis 1 is the construction of a temple. We'll see this again in Genesis 2, but it'll be more localized because remember, that's the process of creation. That's the temple being built. This is the temple built. Genesis 1. Genesis 2 on is going to be the temple being built, and we're not even done with it yet, as we talked about last time. And so, as we look to Genesis 1, we understand that, therefore, we have a job to do. It's not just, God made the world, great. And rather, we understand that, no, God is making the world, and he's going to make it through us, and we have a job then to complete. Our daily lives are to be about being the images of God. Everybody, gets up in arms about fighting with me that, no, man, all man's the image of God no matter what, and they're just so protective of it. Well, be protective of this instead. Be the image. Be the image every day, every hour, in your thoughts, in what you're doing, in what you're watching, and what you're listening to. Be the image. Be the image in your sexuality. Keep your hands to yourself. If the person's not your wife, marry for that reason. Don't just marry because you have fuzzy feelings or you want this in life or that in life. Wrap your job around being the image. Wrap your church life around being the image. Don't just fight with me on this generic idea and then you're not the image most of the time. The whole point of this is that the image joins with God in being creational. Preach the gospel. There's the image par excellence, right? Because if we all fill up the earth with humans and no one's saved, then it's all lost. So it's actually the gospel that seals the deal of filling up the earth with covenant human images. You want to be the image? You want to say, I definitely want to be the image. Great. Go preach the gospel. You want to be the image? Again, live it out in your daily life. Don't just fight me on the image idea. and then not be the image yourself. Speak truth to one another. Speak good, tov, into the lives of one another. Stop speaking evil of one another, chaos. Stop praying evil toward one another. Start praying blessing upon one another, rather than cursing, which is chaotic. Again, be the image. Be the image. Whether you agree with me or not, you as a Christian, be the image in terms of doing what is right and good in the world in the eyes of God. And it starts with your sexuality here, being fruitful and multiplying, male and female, in that relationship, repenting of other relationships that are not the marriage relationship, that are not meant, that they're not being done to actually have children and to bring up covenant children. Repenting of all things that stem from it that are in injustice, that are ultimately chaotic, that don't preserve human life when you do them. Be the image, because that's what God is doing in the world, and that's what we're to be doing in the world. He sits on the throne. We're his images through which he is working and building his temple, his new creation, the Ezekiel temple we looked at when we went through Ezekiel. And so it is through us, though, and not apart from us, that he's doing that. Which is why when you get to the New Testament, what is it? We are his temple, right? He is building us. We're bricks in this temple. I mean, everything is the temple running through. I should have mentioned another book I haven't read, but people say that he says a lot that I say is Greg Beale's Temple and the Church's Mission. I heard that's a great book. I plan on reading it soon, but I haven't read it myself, just, full disclosure. But I have heard it's good. I do recommend it just because I've had solid people recommend it to me. And so that's our job in the world, to see that God's building his temple, God's building the creation, and we're to join with him as his images, as instruments through which he does that. That's really what Genesis 1 is about. It's really not about, here's how God made stuff, now fight with other people who think that he made stuff differently. That's not really the point. In fact, Genesis 1 and 2 are going to flip around and do different things. Which one's literal? Man is made last here. Man is made first in Genesis 2. And you might say, well, because Genesis 2 is the sixth day. It's like, no, it isn't. The plants are made after man. The animals are made after man in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, the plants and animals are made before man. And the biggest discrepancy is you've got man is made first in Genesis 2, then you have animals and plants and cultivated land and all of that made, and then the woman is made last. Whereas in Genesis 1, they're made together, it seems. So my point is not that, these are contradictory and they're different sources. My point is that the author purposely is doing this because he wants to show this is from the perspective of the man, Genesis 2, and the Genesis 1 is the perspective of God having it all done. Genesis 2 is the process of creation that then continues on through chaos, and that God will actually continue to work even through a world that has both order and chaos in it, and he'll continue to work through his people in that chaos. That'll be the ultimate message of Genesis. It'll be the last theological statement made in it, that God actually works good, tov, through the ra'ah, the evil, the chaos. Even though people may have meant it for evil, chaos. And so it's very important that we don't get distracted by these debates. I'm not saying the debates aren't important. That's fine. You want to debate like evolution, and you want to debate like how old the earth is and all that. That's fine. But don't make it an issue of, biblical faithfulness means that you take it literally. That's not true. Biblical faithfulness according to whom? Are you an ancient Near Eastern reader? Is this written to you? Do you understand this imagery? I guarantee they would have. Now, the further they get away from the ancient Near East, the further they get into more of a Hellenistic mindset, and I'm not big on the Greek versus Hebrew mindset, but in this regard, there are things that they leave behind in the ancient Near Eastern world when they entered into the Greek world. When Alexander takes over, and you've got the empire, they are Hellenized in many ways, and they start thinking more in Greek terms in that way. And so there is some stuff lost. But if you look in the ancient Near Eastern world, and you see how they would have understood these things, then you start to pick up that what is literal to them is different than what's literal to you. because you're thinking in a scientific mindset and how did God make this stuff? And they're thinking, why did God make this stuff? What is God continuing to do? What is my role in that? Those are the important questions that Genesis actually answers. Again, and how this contributes to the problem of evil. Why is there still chaos in the world? Because God's still creating. Why is there still chaos? Because God's still creating you. And he's still creating through you. And he's even creating through the chaos itself. And so he needs it as a means. He's decided to use it as a means to create and do good. And that's why it exists. I do want to recommend another book to you. This is called, a compilation of different articles that were originally written for different journals or whatnot, but it's called I Studied Inscriptions Before the Flood. This is kind of ancient Near Eastern backgrounds to Genesis 1 through 11. I think it's important to kind of maybe read that if you're interested in reading more on it. There are works that have ancient Near Eastern works if you want to kind of get the cognitive environment yourself by reading. There's what's called Onnet, which is ancient Near Eastern texts relating to the Old Testament. It's published by Princeton. There's also The Context of Scripture. It's a 3-volume set that's published by Brill. If you feel like, spending your life fortune on books, you might be able to find them online. I don't know if you still can, but you might be able to find them online for free. Either way, those are good works to maybe read. But ultimately, I want us to get this idea that Genesis 1 and Genesis in general is not about here's how God made everything literally, descriptively, and it's a matter of orthodoxy to believe this. I want to note the fact that when the Copernican revolution kind of existed, a lot of people had a problem with it. Luther did not like the idea. A lot of reformers did not like the idea. You almost kind of get a pushback of the idea in the Westminster Confession because you have to literally hold on to the 7 days and whatnot. But no one before that had a problem with having different views of Genesis 1 or what. Augustine had 5 different views during his lifetime. No one accused Augustine as being a heretic. That's because your view of Genesis 1, if you're not saying something crazy or whatever that actually affects, real Christian theology and real Christian ethics or something, then it's pretty much open. It's not really an issue of heresy. We've made it that way because we're fighting against people who are trying to undermine the Bible with science. And I would argue the same thing that I argued before, that, yeah, their version of evolution is undermining, but there's no reason to accept their version of evolution. You can accept a different version, or you can just reject it outright. But Genesis 1 is not really commenting on the subject at all. And so if you accept it or reject it, you need to do so based on other reasons. And there may be other reasons, other good reasons that you do accept this or reject that or whatever. But it shouldn't be from this passage. That's not what it's teaching. It's teaching instead what God is doing, who God is, what he's doing, who you are, and what you're to be doing in the world as his instrument for good, for order, for creation. Well, let's go ahead and bow now in a word of prayer. Father, again, we thank you for this. I pray that you're able to make sense of what I said. There's so much information. It is impossible just to do this chapter without just doing an entire series on just this chapter alone, and yet we don't really have time to do that sort of thing. And so I do pray that what I said will be sufficient to understand both this chapter in itself and also as an introduction to the book of Genesis and its theology and ethics, as well as an introduction to the entire Bible and its theology and ethics. Lord, I pray that your people will be enriched by it. They will glorify you with this information. They will see you in a new light. They will see themselves in a new light, and they will live accordingly. We pray this all for your glory and the exaltation of your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.